I was invited by Taylor to his home for dinner, but I ended up running into his cold and mysterious older brother, Asher, who seemed strangely hostile toward me. Just as I found myself in an awkward situation, Taylor received a text message and headed off to a party, leaving me all alone at his house. The warm light spilling from the living room doorway had once bathed the space in a cozy glow, and the muffled murmurs of conversation carried with them an air of lived-in warmth. But just as I raised my eyes, all sound seemed to be abruptly cut off by an invisible force. Even the light itself appeared to be torn apart. A towering figure stood firmly in the doorway, its presence so commanding that the very atmosphere of the room seemed to plummet in an instant. There he was, like a black sculpture that had suddenly materialized out of thin air, exuding an aura of untouchable distance that froze the previously welcoming ambience in its tracks. At first, my brain instinctively categorized him simply as some man. Maybe a friend of Taylor's or a neighbor. Or perhaps not. No, he wasn't just some man. He was a man brimming with presence. Leaning against the doorframe, his back straight as a pine tree, he wore a black Henley shirt that clung tightly to his body, outlining smooth yet powerfully defined muscles. The muscles of his forearms were faintly visible beneath the sleeves, radiating a cold, hard intensity honed over years of relentless discipline. With his arms tightly crossed over his chest, a posture that wasn't casual at all, more like a deliberate attempt to shut out everything around him. His gaze swept across the living room with an innate sense of detachment and scrutiny. It was as if this place had never been meant for him in the first place, and his mere presence felt like an unwelcome accident he'd rather not have been part of. He was incredibly tall, far from just being tall. He was truly towering. So tall that I had to tilt my head slightly upward just to meet his eyes. Taylor himself already stood at 1.82 meters, but this man was at least 190 meters tall, with a physique every rugby coach dreamed of in a backline player. Broad shoulders, thick, powerful arms, and a chest so solid it seemed as though his very breath could stretch his shirt to the breaking point. And then there was his hair, dark, almost jet black, with natural waves that gave it a tousled yet perfectly styled look, falling just below his jawline. He was staring straight at me. There was no smile, no curiosity, and certainly no welcome. His gaze was sharp as a blade of ice, devoid of any superfluous emotion, pure coldness and scrutiny, almost as if he were examining an insignificant object. When his eyes fell upon me, the weight of that stare made my breath catch in my throat, my stomach clenched involuntarily, and even the tips of my fingers began to tingle faintly. There wasn't a trace of friendliness in his eyes, not a hint of warmth. Just a bottomless, piercing scrutiny, a look that seemed to be calculating something, yet was so carefully concealed that one couldn't possibly guess his thoughts, leaving me feeling utterly chilled to the bone. Then Taylor's voice broke the silence between us. "Wait, what? Brother." He stepped forward quickly, wrapping his arm loosely around the man's shoulder. The man barely reacted, moving slightly beneath Taylor's arm. Not exactly a response, more like a reluctant tolerance. I stared at them in astonishment. "Brother?" I repeated, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Taylor grinned broadly, as carefree and unbothered as ever. "Yeah, this is my brother." I glanced at Taylor, then back at the man who was still standing there, tall and erect, yet utterly expressionless. This was Taylor's brother? I knew he had a brother serving in the Navy. Taylor had mentioned him once or twice, always in a vague tone, as if talking about someone living on another planet altogether. But I'd never imagined it would be like this. Taylor was sunny and cheerful, with a warm, infectious smile. This man, by contrast, seemed like a shadow itself. Taylor was lean and athletic, his muscles tight and his movements swift and agile. This man, on the other hand, was broader and more rugged, as if carved from rough stone. Taylor's brown hair was always tousled and boyish. This man's hair was darker than midnight itself, soft, wavy curls cascading down to his chin, accentuating his sharply defined features and piercing eyes. Meanwhile, Taylor exuded warmth from every pore. Yet this man wore an expression that seemed to say, anywhere else would be better than here. Shaking off the eerie tension that had crept over me, I forced myself back to reality, stepped forward, and managed to force a polite smile. "Nice to meet. You're late," he said, not even lifting his eyelids. His voice was utterly flat, devoid of any emotion, but it carried an unmistakable sense of authority, like a cold dagger that sliced cleanly through my words and pierced right through the composure I'd so painstakingly maintained. The words froze halfway out of my mouth. My mind went completely blank in an instant. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. My limbs felt as though they'd been nailed to the spot, and even my breathing grew stiff and unnatural. Taylor's parents behind me burst into an awkward laughter that sounded strangely forced. I stared at him in utter astonishment, completely thrown off balance. My tongue felt as if it were tied in knots, and all I could manage was a muffled, sound. My cheeks flushed crimson in an instant, then turned icy cold the next second. Embarrassment and helplessness washed over me like a tidal wave. He finally raised his eyes to meet mine, but his gaze was colder than ever before. His voice was sharp and brittle, like shards of ice. "Someone kindly invited you, and this is how you choose to thank them, by showing up late?" As soon as he finished speaking, he looked away, as if even glancing at me for another second felt utterly unnecessary. I just kept staring at him. Was he serious? Taylor's mom immediately stepped in to smooth things over, her smile a bit too bright. "What my son Asher is trying to say is, we've missed you so much, Penny. We're absolutely thrilled you could make it." She gently took my hand and led me toward the kitchen. I let her guide me, my cheeks burning hot. Taylor grabbed my other hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze as he gently pulled me forward. I struggled to keep up, my fingers gripping Taylor's hand so tightly that my knuckles turned white, but I still had to awkwardly sidestep Asher's towering frame, because there he stood, utterly unmoving, showing not the slightest hint of yielding or making way, as if I were nothing more than an insignificant wisp of air. Not an inch. I slipped past him, my shoulder accidentally brushing lightly against his arm, a sensation like passing by a statue, hard, cold, and utterly immovable. I never dared to look up at him again. The kitchen was warm and bright, the dining table laden with food, almost groaning under its weight. A huge roasted chicken with a golden, crispy crust, a big bowl of buttery mashed potatoes garnished with chopped herbs, roasted green beans with almonds, a basket of steaming, freshly baked bread, a vividly colorful salad brimming with cranberries and crumbled feta cheese, and several bowls of rich gravy and aromatic sauces. It was as if the entire Thanksgiving feast had been transplanted right here. I turned to Mrs. Hayes, still struggling to calm my racing heart. "These look absolutely divine. Thank you so much for inviting me." She smiled warmly at me and said, "Honey, you're always welcome here." We all took our seats, and Taylor pulled me over to the chair beside him. Asher sat at the far end of the table, as far away from me as possible. And that was just fine. Maybe the abundance of food on the table would be enough to help me forget the weight of his gaze pressing down on me. Taylor was so excited he could hardly sit still, his smile as wide and radiant as a child's on Christmas morning. "I had no idea you were coming back, man," Taylor said, picking up a loaf of bread. It was a last-minute decision. His older brother, Asher, replied in a tone that was sharp and abrupt, sharp enough to cut through glass. Taylor seemed oblivious to the impatience in his brother's voice, or maybe he'd simply grown accustomed to it and chose to ignore it deliberately. As Mr. Hayes sliced the roasted chicken, he chuckled and said, "He just arrived this morning. He hasn't had a proper break in 3 years, and this time, they finally granted him some time off." 3 years. For 3 long years, he'd been wearing combat boots, enduring battles soaked in blood and violence, and facing horrors that the Navy SEALs themselves never spoke about. I glanced up briefly and caught Asher looking right at me. I swallowed hard and quickly looked away. "Wow," I managed to say, this is truly amazing." Ash merely quirked the corner of his mouth, not even bothering to give me a full expression. His praise seemed to him no different from the noise drifting through the air. That nonchalant indifference only added to his mysterious aura, leaving me utterly unable to guess what he was really thinking. I tried hard to steer the conversation in another direction. "How's your job with the Navy?" He deliberately slowed down his pace and put down his knife and fork. "I'm afraid I can't disclose any information," he said coolly, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. After finishing his remark, he picked up his cutlery again, moving with precision and mechanical efficiency, as if their earlier exchange had never taken place at all. The atmosphere around him once more turned icy and closed off. The ensuing silence was so heavy it felt suffocating. I nodded, forcing myself to appear calm and casual, though the tension was already pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. Fortunately, Mrs. Hayes stepped in just in time. "Penny, how's the ballet going? The rehearsal for the gala must be really heating up by now." I grabbed onto this topic like a lifeline. "It's going okay," I said. "Although the pressure is intense, I'm definitely making progress. The audition has been moved up. Hundreds of dancers are competing for the same spot, so..." I shrugged my shoulders. No one can really predict what'll happen. Just then I heard a voice. It was soft yet piercing, a sneer. I turned my head to look. At that moment, Ash wasn't looking at me at all. He was calmly and deliberately eating his food. The faint smirk lingering at the corner of his lips had already vanished, as if that dismissive sound I'd just heard had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination. Yet the hint of contempt lingered unmistakably in the air. He conveyed hostility with such understated composure, hiding it so perfectly that you couldn't find even the slightest hint of it, making him all the more mysterious and unpredictable. Others don't seem to have noticed at all. Or maybe they did notice, but deliberately pretended not to hear. I plunged the fork into the mashed potatoes with more force than necessary, almost too much. What's wrong with him, anyway? I don't know him. He doesn't know me either. Yet somehow, just from a single glance, he's already decided he hates me. The conversation went on. Taylor talked about soccer. Mrs. Hayes teased Mr. Hayes about his burnt toast. All the usual everyday chatter. But beneath it all, there was an undercurrent, a subtle, barely perceptible current that I couldn't ignore. Because no matter what I did, I found myself involuntarily looking up. And every time I looked up, Asher was already staring right at me. Standing beside Mrs. Hayes, I carefully placed the dishes into the dishwasher, while the men's voices drifted in from the living room, mingled with the sound of the game playing on the TV. Usually, Taylor would always be here, casually wiping the counter and secretly grabbing a few extra loaves of bread whenever no one was looking. But tonight, Mrs. Hayes smiled and told him to go join his older brother, who'd just returned. Without a second thought, he set aside his usual duties, quickly kissed me on the temple, mumbled something like, "I owe you one," and dashed off. "I'm so full," I said with a laugh as I emptied the remnants from my plate into the trash can. "I'm afraid I'll have to roll home." The dinner was absolutely delicious. I've got to learn Mr. Hayes' recipe for roasted green beans. Mrs. Hayes chuckled too, shaking her head as she rinsed out the casserole dish. "Don't go overboard praising him. Asher suddenly called this morning saying he was coming back, and he's been frantically searching for recipes online all morning, just cramming at the last minute." Hearing his name, my hand froze mid-motion. My body instinctively tensed its shoulders, as if my body had reacted to that name even before my mind had time to process it. Mrs. Hayes noticed. She carefully set down the casserole dish, wiped her hands dry with a towel, leaned one hip against the counter, and looked at me with a mother's uniquely gentle yet keen gaze. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice so low it wouldn't be drowned out by the TV. "I'm sorry for the way he spoke to you earlier." I stared at her in surprise, never expecting her to apologize so directly, an apology I hadn't even realized I needed until it was right there, laid bare before me. "You don't have to apologize," I hurriedly said, my words coming out somewhat jumbled, but Mrs. Hayes simply gave me a knowing look. "I have to apologize," she said. "You didn't deserve to be treated that way." I lowered my head, tracing with my fingertips the crack on the counter, unsure of what to say. "He's not targeting you, Penny," she continued softly. "He's like that with most people, cold and sharp-tongued. He's been this way for quite some time now. I nodded slowly. Her words landed heavily in my heart, leaving me feeling strangely uneasy. It's just, I paused, frowning slightly as I struggled to find the right words. Your whole family is so kind and warm. It's really hard for me to understand why he's like this. Mrs. Hayes smiled, but her smile carried a hint of sadness that made my throat tighten ever so slightly.
His job isn't easy, she said.
It's not the kind of job you can just leave behind once you walk out the door. He's probably seen horrors that none of us could even begin to imagine. I nodded again, and a wave of guilt washed over me. I'd never thought about any of this, really I hadn't. All I'd ever seen was his coldness, his brusque words, and his gaze that seemed to reduce me to nothing at all. I'd never once stopped to wonder what had built those walls inside him. Mrs. Hayes reached out and gently took my hand. That simple gesture brought me a sense of calm. Be patient with him, she said softly. It's not your fault. It's just life itself, pushing him this way. I gave her a small but genuine smile and squeezed her hand in return. I will, I said. She patted my hand once more, then turned back to the sink. Go join the men. Leave this to me. I hesitated for a moment, feeling obliged to stay and help out of politeness, but she smiled and waved me away, already resuming her dishwashing. Then I dried my hands with a towel, quietly slipped out of the kitchen, and made my way toward the living room, guided by the familiar sounds of conversation and the faint glow of the television. The living room was cozy, though the light was somewhat dim, save for the bluish glow emanating from the TV screen. Taylor was sprawled lazily on the sofa, his feet propped up, a can of soda resting on the armchair beside him. Mr. Hayes sat in his recliner, occasionally tossing good-natured remarks and playful jibes at the referee every few minutes, his voice brimming with relaxed energy. And then there was Asher. He was sitting in the farthest corner of the room, one leg stretched out and one arm draped over the back of the chair. His posture seemed relaxed, yet his gaze was sharp as an eagle's, unflinching, scanning the entire room with quiet intensity. Especially when his eyes lingered on me, they seemed to hold something elusive and indefinable, a mix of scrutiny, detachment, and perhaps something else entirely, something that remained utterly mysterious, like the bottomless depths of a dark lake. He didn't say a word. When I walked into the room, he didn't even glance at me. Yet for some reason, his very presence seemed to alter the entire atmosphere of the room, leaving me with a tightness in my chest. I sat carefully on the edge of the sofa next to Taylor, pulling my knees up close to my body, trying not to take up too much space, and doing my best not to notice that Asher's silence was louder than any other sound in the room. Taylor grinned, reached out, and grabbed my ankle, pulling one of my feet onto his lap. You've been standing all day, he said, his thumb gently pressing against the arch of my foot beneath my sock. I smiled and half-heartedly slapped his hand away. I'm fine, really. Mr. Hayes chuckled. Let this kid pamper you a bit. That teacher of yours has been pushing you so hard. I bet your poor little feet have been begging for mercy long ago. Again, I found myself laughing, this time a genuine, heartfelt kind of ease. I leaned back against the sofa cushion, and for a few minutes, I simply let myself sink into that feeling, the sense of safety, the familiarity. Taylor's hand was gentle and soothing, and the living room was filled with the warm, authentic scent of cinnamon and aged wood. Yet even amidst all this, I could still feel it, the weight of his gaze. Asher's gaze. Silent, watchful. Like an invisible storm cloud no one else seemed to notice. The TV was blaring, and Taylor and Mr. Hayes were exchanging playful commentary on the game, bursting into laughter whenever one of the teams made a mistake. But Asher didn't say a single word. I took a risky glance at him, a quick, fleeting glance, and realized he wasn't watching the TV at all. His eyes were fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched tight, and his shoulders beneath his Henry shirt were rigidly tense, as if he were desperately holding back some emotion, or perhaps hiding a secret altogether. The air around him seemed to freeze completely, though he was right there, sitting quietly. He somehow felt utterly unreachable. In that profound silence lay so many untold stories, shrouded in a mystery that made one hesitate to probe too deeply. I quickly looked away, my heart beating a little faster than usual. After a moment, I pulled my foot off Taylor's leg, stood up, and straightened my cardigan. "I'm going to the bathroom," I said, not looking directly at anyone in particular. Taylor mumbled absent-mindedly, his eyes fixed intently on the replayed footage on the screen. I slipped out of the room quietly, making my way upstairs by memory, my fingers tracing along the wall for balance. The bathroom was tiny and pleasantly warm. The mirror was still fogged over, its surface coated with a thin layer of condensation left behind by the lingering heat in the house. I closed the door behind me, leaned against it, and closed my eyes. Just what's wrong with me? Why does being near him make me feel so uncomfortable, like I'm wearing a sweater 2 sizes too small? It's just because he's a stranger, I firmly told myself. It's only that, in a place that's always been so safe, a stranger has suddenly appeared, and I'm simply not used to it yet. I'll get used to it. I have to get used to it. He's Taylor's older brother.
This is Taylor's family.
I'm not going to let a cold stare ruin all of this. I splashed some cold water onto my wrists, patted my face dry, smoothed out my cardigan, and slowly exhaled. Be friendly. Be patient. That's what Mrs. Hayes said. I can do it. I reached out to flip the light switch, turned off the light, then backed out of the bathroom, but ran straight into a wall. Wait, that's not a wall.
It's a chest.
Broad and solid, faintly scented with soap, and something even deeper, somehow more profound. I stumbled backward a step, then looked up. The height kept rising until my gaze finally met a pair of dark eyes. It was Asher. There he stood, less than a foot away from me, staring at me with that same elusive expression. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and his body remained utterly still, save for a slight tilt of his head, as if he could see right through all my polite smiles, my frantic breathing, and the awkwardness I was desperately trying to hide. In his eyes, there was neither surprise nor displeasure, only a calm, knowing serenity. And it was precisely this calmness that made me even more flustered, leaving me utterly baffled as to why he'd suddenly appeared here. I'm sorry, I stammered, instinctively taking another step back. He didn't say a single word, absolutely nothing. The silence between us grew heavier and more tense with each passing moment. I fidgeted nervously, rubbing the sides of my jeans, desperate to do something, to look anywhere but straight into those eyes that seemed capable of dissecting me utterly and leaving me utterly exposed. Seeing that he still remained silent, I lowered my head, sidestepped around him, my heart pounding so rapidly that I was sure he could hear it. I dashed down the stairs and returned to the living room, but found it empty. There was no one on the sofa. The TV was still flickering, though the volume had been turned down. From the kitchen came murmured voices, the Hayeses, speaking softly, laughing lightly. I couldn't make out exactly what they were saying. But Tyler was gone. I frowned, scanning the room with growing confusion. Just as I was about to call out to him, a voice behind me broke the silence.
He's gone.
I spun around abruptly. Ash was leaning against the stair railing, one hand gripping the banister so tightly that his knuckles had turned slightly pale, as if he were struggling mightily to keep himself in check. His gaze fell upon me, devoid of pity, devoid of mockery. It was simply filled with an unfathomable calmness. Yet precisely this calmness made the situation feel even more eerie, utterly impossible for me to read his thoughts.
What?
I asked, my throat parched and dry.
He got a text message, Ash said flatly.
It said there was a party somewhere. He said he'd be back later. I stared at him, as if those words hadn't quite registered in my mind yet. Taylor gone? Right here, on a night when our family was supposed to be together? Leaving me all alone here? I pulled my phone out of my pocket, my heart sinking little by little, but there was nothing there at all. There were no texts, no missed calls, nothing at all. I stood there, my heart churning with a mix of emotions. None of them felt good. I forced a smile, shoved my phone back into my pocket, and walked toward the kitchen, softly thanking the Hayeses for dinner and for everything they'd done. I deliberately ignored Mrs. Hayes's overly concerned gaze, as well as Mr. Hayes's gesture of ruffling my hair like he was dealing with a child. Then I picked up my bag and shoes from the living room, pulling my cardigan tighter around me. Just as I was about to reach the door, I felt that same gaze again. I turned around, swallowing hard with effort. "Nice to meet you," I said to Asher, forcing the words out even though they tasted metallic in my mouth.
He didn't reply.
He didn't move. Even my eyelids didn't blink. I gave myself a slight nod, then quietly slipped out of the room and melted into the night. The night air was bitterly cold. My cardigan simply couldn't keep out the chill, but I kept walking nonetheless, my hands buried deep in my pockets, my head bowed low. The cold seeped through my clothes, pierced my skin, and even began to erode the fragile facade I'd been desperately trying to maintain. I kept moving forward, my thoughts swirling so chaotically that they were nearly impossible to grasp. There was the bitterness and loss over Taylor's sudden departure without a word. He'd promised he'd always stand by my side, yet this very moment, he'd left me utterly alone. There was confusion over Asher's utter indifference, and a faint, inexplicable stirring deep within me. His gaze, his silence, that mysterious, inscrutable aura surrounding him, it drew me in like a magnet, yet it also stabbed at me like an ice pick. And there was the sheer embarrassment of my own situation. Though I'd been invited as a guest, I'd ended up leaving in such a humiliating fashion. My chest is churning with a mix of emotions, frustration, confusion, resentment, and even a tiny, unacknowledged spark of concern for that cold, enigmatic man. These feelings are intertwined, weighing heavily on my heart and making even my breath feel painful.